I'm Gary Schroeder. My dad was Gordon Schroeder, who had a long history in the racing industry. Grew up in Santa Ana. Graduated from Santa Ana High School in 1933, which I just found his diploma through a scrapbook, so that was kind of interesting. In 1938, he and one of his good buddies decided they were big-time race fans, so they got in his buddy's car and drove to Indianapolis for the 500 because his friend knew somebody that worked on Rex Mays' pit crew. So they got back there. They didn't have any credentials, didn't have any passes, didn't have any money, but they worked out a deal with a guy with a gas station not too far from the racetrack that if they cleaned out the shop, swept it up, and do whatever, they could stay in the parking lot and use the guy's restroom to wash up, clean up, and do whatever. So they went over to the racetrack, and his friend saw his buddy and yelled at him through the fence and asked, hey, we'll work on cars, we'll do whatever, sweep the floors, and does Rex need any help? And he said, no, it doesn't need any help, but I believe Ted Horn might. So they got him hooked up with Cotton Henning, who I believe was Ted Horn's crew chief mechanic then. And so he ended up working on Ted Horn's pit crew in 1938. Through that association, they found out what a good machinist he was, clever, good mechanic. When he got back to California, he was hired at Sampson Motors by Alden Sampson, who Sampson Motors and was owned by Riley Brett, who was Louis Meyer's chief mechanic for all those years. So Sampson basically subsidized Sampson Motors, and they bought what was the remains of the Stutz Blackhawk that Frank Lockhart was killed in the late 20s at Daytona when a tire blew. So they took the 16-cylinder Sampson engine out of the Stutz Blackhawk, which was actually a common crankcase, two crankshafts on two 91 cubic inch supercharged Millers on a common crankcase with a gear drive on the back and an output shaft. And they built the Sampson Motors 16-cylinder race car around it. So because the engine was so heavy, they wanted to make it get the weight distribution a little better. So Gordon designed the rear transaxle for it. And it was a DD on rear end. And they built, so I believe the first year there was driven by Bob Swanson in 1939 and 1940. They had mechanical issues both times. I forget exactly what happened, but the engine continued to run. They never had any engine issues, which was pretty amazing for as complicated as the engine was. And during World War II, Riley Brett, let me backtrack a little bit. So in the late 38, 39, after he went to work at Sampson Motors, midget racing became really popular. And Leo Goosen had just designed the Offie midget engine. So Miller had gone bankrupt by then, so Alden Sampson, Riley Brett, had hired Leo Goosen and my dad, who was working there at the time. So they designed the Sampson midget engine, which was a 4-cylinder double overhead cam, 4-valve per cylinder, 5-main bearing, 97 cubic inch midget engine. Similar to the Offie, but it's a more standard crankcase. It's not a barrel type crankcase, so it actually has the case is machined and then with main caps and everything like you'd expect in more of a standardized engine. And I believe it actually had insert bearings in it, which Gordon always said that it was one of the first engine with insert bearings, so non-poured or non-baveted bearings. Again, double overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, 5-main bearing. They got that. They only got 2 of them built. A guy named Ronnie Householder got the first one. And at one time, he had every track record at Gilmore Stadium from 1 to 100 laps, I believe. And the Offies were complaining and whatever. But then World War II started, and Sam's Riley Brett figured out they could make a lot more money making airplane parts than they could midget engines. So that kind of died on the vine. And Gordon continued to work there during the war, making airplane parts, whatever was needed. During that time, he was able to get the 16-cylinder Samson Indy car that Bob Swanson drove. Went through it, did it, and had a sponsorship such as it was from Spike Jones, and ran it in 1946 at Indy with Sam Hanks as the driver. And hey, Reggie, Sam Hanks as the driver, and managed to qualify in the third position outside of the front row. But they had some oiling issues, and it was started smoking shortly after the race started, so they were black flagged. It was something was gone wrong in the scavenge system, so it was building up oil in the crankcase, so they had to DNF'd on that. So at that time, he was still involved in to do customized machine work, and had still raced midgets in the late 40s through the years. And in late 49, 48, 49, he and Emil Diet started a company, and they designed and built sports cars and race cars and whatever. They built the sports car for one of the famous actors. It was Diet, who did it? Eric Zausner and Steve Moll just actually restored it for Rochester. It was for Rochester, Jack Benny fame, I believe. But during that time, they also figured out he built a couple Indy cars, and with limited success, some success. And in 1951, 50 and 51, he started production, or they started building. He'd gone out of his zone by then, left Emil, and he built 2 Indy cars in 1950 for the 1951 Indy 500. One was a Brown Motor Car Company car, and one was the Blakely Oil Special, driven by Bobby Ball. They were unique in that the frame, it wasn't a steel tubular frame. The frame rails were formed aluminum, riveted together. The cross members and suspension and bulkheads and everything in the car were cast magnesium cross members. It was similar to the Maserati that Ted Horn and Wilbur Shaw drove, and which he worked on, so that might have been some of the ideas for the design of it. So pretty unique construction. Bobby Ball had good success when he was so late working on the car that they didn't get there till the second week, or get a chance to qualify till the second week of qualifying. And he was one of the faster qualifiers, but due to the rules then, the second week people started behind the first weekend qualifiers, so he managed to get up all the way up to 5th in the race, so had a good run. The car continued to run, ran for 4 more years with limited success. Jimmy Bryan drove it a couple times. Actually, I'll go back, Bobby drove it the next year, crashed in qualifying, and they didn't get it repaired for the race, so that would have been 52. Jimmy Bryan drove it 1953, and they had an engine issue. 54, they missed the race, and in 55, Keith Andrews drove it and did qualify for the race and ran towards the back. The car was getting pretty obsolete by then. We were able to find it and get it restored. And what was left of the car was actually found by Jeff Ball, Bobby's son, in Colorado in the 70s, and Gordon got a start on it, got the chassis back together. Wayne Ewing did some body work on it. We had quite a bit of the original parts, and it got restoration went along slowly, and then my father passed away in 95, and I was able to find some more of the original suspension parts for it and whatever, so we started the restoration project and finished the restoration of the Blakely car in about 2000, 2001, like that, so it's complete now. how he got, I'll go back. So in the 50s, Bobby Ball was staying at the house with him. They were obviously good friends. And he was driving a midget at Carrell Speedway and was involved in a crash and was knocked unconscious. And my mother Carmen was a nurse, and she went down. So they called and said he was in the hospital. So she went down to the hospital to see if there was anything they could do or whatever. And she said he looked like he'd fallen off a bicycle. There was a skin on his knee and no other issues except that he was unconscious, and he never regained consciousness. They moved him, put a feeding tube in him. He was breathing on his own, and after a period of time they moved him to Phoenix, and he passed away, I believe, a little over a year later. And they did an autopsy, and he died. He passed away from appendicitis, which was really hard on my parents. And shortly after that, Rex Mays and Dorothy Mays were staying with him, and Rex was running the race at Del Mar in the champ dirt cars, AAA champ dirt cars, and Rex was involved in a wreck and was killed there. So that was another pretty serious deal. So that kind of soured my dad on auto racing. Maybe this is a little tough sport. So by that time he'd built up a good reputation and was doing machine design and specialty machinery design and equipment for General Controls and a lot of different companies and whatever. And had a shop in Burbank where he'd actually built the 2 Indy cars. And in the early 60s, racing was starting to become popular again. You had Don Edmonds was building cars. Curtis's obviously was over by then. So Don Edmonds come along. Jim Colbert at CAE were building sprint car kits. There were several. That was locally here, California. And then there was several guys in the Midwest that were building lots of cars every year. And steering boxes, manual steering boxes, was a real issue. So they knew, through the guys that had been involved with racing, they knew my dad had built steering boxes before. When he would build a car for himself or whoever he was working for, building cars for, and he'd do steering boxes, he'd build 8 or 10 of them, because it's just as easy to build a small number as it is 1 or 2. So, and then he could sell them to help subsidize the rest of the deal. Kuzma typically would buy them, so most of the Kuzma dirt cars had Schroeder steerings in them. So those guys contacted him in the mid-early 60s and said, hey, we can't get steering boxes. Why don't you resurrect, or can you build steering boxes for us? So he went home a couple afternoons a little early from work and designed a Schroeder steering box, and came back, and we made the patterns and everything at the shop in Burbank, made the castings, machined everything, and started manufacturing steering boxes for Edmonds and CAE, and then were distributed through Speedway Motors and whatever, the popular item. And he was like, well, we'll make a few of these, and then the novelty will wear off or whatever. And I think the last ones we made, I manufactured, was in about 2018 when I'd sold the business, and we'd made just over 10,000 steering boxes in that period of time. And he also designed, when the rear engine cars started becoming popular, he designed a rack and pinion steering for the rear engine application, and we had those. He built those for Watson and whoever, but the most successful one was build all the steering boxes for Dan Gurney. So until the very last Eagle had Schroeder steerings in them. All the Formula One early cars, 60s, 70s Eagles, all had Schroeder steerings in them in the rack and pinion variety. So we continued making steering boxes. As Gordon got older, I slowly took over the shop, the management running of the shop and the steering assembly and or whatever. And then in the early 80s, I started racing 3/4 midgets, and they took a little different torsion bar this length and stuff. So through some advice from him and whatever was material to use, because he used to make bars, some custom bars for Frank Curtis and the Curtis Indy car, so he had some suggestions on material and whatever that we used. And so I started making torsion bars and ran them in my own car, and then just typical deal, you'd make extras and we'd sell a few, and the guys that were getting them were real happy with them and liked them better than some of the current brands on the market. So that expanded and expanded to the point where we were making lots of torsion bars, and we ended up making stuff for Jeff Gordon through John Bickford. I met Jeff when Jeff was running the midgets, and was real successful. So we were making custom bars for the midgets and the sprint cars and whatever. And then when Jeff went into NASCAR, we sort of followed him there, and there was some issue. They were having some issues with some the anti-roll bars, sway bars they'd use in some of the NASCAR cars. So through John Bickford and Ray Evernham, we designed, updated and upgraded the sway bars the NASCAR guys were using. And then we went some bigger sizes, and as the cars changed what they needed, so we went all the way up to, when we started they were 1-inch spline bars. When we finished, some of the last generation bars were 2 3/4-inch spline bars on them, and they were using the soft spring big bar setup to make them fast. It helped the aero package on the cars. It was from early 90s, Jeff's first couple years, and from then on, I think it was for a 15 or 18-year period, we had all the sway bars in every car in the Daytona 500. So, which was I thought was pretty special. We also built all the bars for typical most of the sprint car deals. We won the World Outlaw Championships, I don't know, 10 or 15 years in a row, and the USAC National Sprint Car and Midget Championships. So the torsion bar business kind of exceeded the steering business, but we still manufactured the steerings for some of the smaller classes, the mini sprints and that stuff, because as tires progressed and everything, and manual steering wasn't really successful with the bigger tires and stuff on the front. You actually needed a power steering, so we didn't follow that, go into that. We made a few prototype ones, but they were too expensive to manufacture because we did everything pretty much from scratch. And the other power steering manufacturers, they took a GM box and then used their guts, which is the expensive part to manufacture, the ball screw, spool valve and whatever, and then made aluminum housing for it, whatever, which was probably the way to go. And so we didn't pursue that. We just continued making the torsion bars and manual steerings. I obviously grew up around racing and midgets and used to help on Jim Sullivan's championship winning mission midgets that everybody from Doug Wolfgang to Gary Patterson to Hank Butcher and Wally Pankratz and whatever all drove. I worked on those, and during that time the 3/4 midgets were becoming popular again, and that was a lot more affordable class. So I built a 3/4 midget with the help of Wayne Ewing, who was hanging around the shop at that time, kind of helping my dad on some of the restoration projects and whatever. So that was early 80s, 1982, 83. There was Jim Naylor had built Ventura Raceway at that time, and we were ran a weekly show there with the 3/4 midgets, and a lot of good race drivers were there. It was really competitive. You had Corey Kruzman, you had Paige Jones, PJ Jones, Jay Drake, all went on to become pretty successful race drivers in their career. I just stayed here and raced locally with my cars and whatever, and keep the shop going. I was fortunate enough, I won the track championship 3 out of 5 years, finished second, 4 times. So had a pretty successful career, I thought, for that, and then through my association with Sleepy Trip, who raced in New Zealand every year for a long time. I met some of the promoters down there, and I started going down and racing the 3/4 midget in New Zealand in 1983, which was a really wonderful experience, and met a lot of people that I still keep in contact with today and go down and visit when they visit when we come up here. So when I raced in New Zealand from like 83 all the way up to the mid 90s, so every Christmas, so that was good fun. And then from growing up around all these cars and manufacturing parts for them, I always had a history or enjoyed the cars and stooged on cars. I actually in 69, 70, when I'd go in the summertime, I worked for Bobby Unser for one summer for Jed Phillips and the Little Red, and then I worked for Clint Bronner and Jim McGee when Jimmy Carruthers and Art Pollard drove the cars, and we'd run Milwaukee and then tow it. You know, it was a little different than our big time successful racing team had a Ford station wagon that we towed the cars with, and we left Milwaukee and drove straight through to Ontario for the first race at Ontario, which was pretty fun. And then that was before radio, so I was the guy with the chalkboard out on the front straightaway for Jimmy Carruthers, and he wanted to see something every lap. So as he'd go by, I'd put the lap speeds or tell him when the pit was going to pit. You'd pit 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So he could get ready and get in a position to come in the pits and whatever. So that was fun. So I've always been kind of around racing and whatever. So those cars always interested me. So I've been fortunate enough through the years to be able to find stuff when available or underground. So pick up some pretty significant Indy cars. So I do have 71 Eagle that Bobby Unser ran with a turbo offie in it. It was the first car to break the record at Michigan at over 190 miles an hour in 1971. Have the Blakely oil car that my dad built for Bobby Ball. Through Don Edmonds, after I'd restored a couple of those cars, I was looking for more stuff to do and maybe some earlier cars. And through Don Edmonds, who was a big time car collector and whatever, he had actually had both Perung cars from 1935. A guy named Gil Perung had two cars in 1935 that he raced, and they were both bought. A friend of mine, Mark and Linda Montanos, bought the front drive, and I bought the rear drive car, which is actually a Perung chassis with all Miller running gear and a 220 Miller in it, and restored those. I restored the Doc McKenzie car. It finished 8th or 9th in 1935, and actually averaged just over 100 miles an hour for the entire race, which is pretty impressive when it's on bricks with a 220 Miller and a riding mechanic. So I've got that one. I've got the 1979 VPJ that Parnelli Jones, they built it, Parnelli's for, I believe the car was built a couple years earlier, and I haven't exactly found the history, but I believe Van Gaius might have driven it. I'm working on getting more history from the chassis number, but it was a car that Foyt won his last championship with in '79 that Gilmore sponsored, and won 2 or 3 races that year in it. And let's see what else. Another project is 81 Eagle that's in the rafters, so I'll hopefully get on that one of these days. And a 70s Champ dirt car that Ronnie Ward built. Got to get that going. So too many projects, not quite enough time, but I'm working on it.